call Jack. Hello?
Yeah, what's up?
Not much. Just trying to figure out what music to listen to. You got any suggestions?
Actually, yeah. I've been starting to listen to some Duke.
Ellington? Like Duke Ellington, the pianist from the 30s?
No, Duke Dennis. Yes, Duke Ellington from the 30s.
Nah, that's crazy. Is he any good?
Yes, very good. I've actually been meaning to tell you about this documentary I saw from some classmates in history class. I think it was Michael and Cole.
Alright, bet. Just send me the link and I'll watch it.
Bet, see you later.
Alright, bye. Welcome to a documentary by Michael Nemo and Cole Chenier, The Influence of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was preceded by another famous event in the African American history called the Great Migration. To set a picture, this was fresh after the end of the Civil War and abolishing slavery, but the fight wasn't done there. Many African Americans that have newly been given the title of a citizen were still living in the southern states, where plantations where their families were once enslaved and tortured were still there to haunt them. Even after slavery was abolished, many citizens down south became laborers, essentially doing the same work as a slave, but this time for a small wage. The federal government took it upon themselves to secure the rights and overall welfare of their new citizens, to little success. In the South, violence and bigotry, fueled by racism, were something that plagued the lives of many Africans. Many decided that enough was enough, so in the early 1900s, the Great Migration started. Black people in the South migrated into the North in hopes that they could find better paying jobs in city factories, rather than back-breaking work in humid farms for measly pay. Black neighborhoods formed in several cities in the northern states. One of these cities was NYC. In 1910, several blocks in Harlem were purchased by African American realtors. Not only was this a welcome home to black migrants from the South, but people coming from the Caribbean as well, who were also enslaved and mistreated incredibly. In total, the migration from 1910 to 1970 moved over 6 million blacks from the South to the North. Most of these African Americans went from being slaves and laborers to artists, writers, musicians, and entertainers.
Our thesis is that the Harlem Renaissance helped African Americans both find occupations and express themselves through several visual arts. During this time, a plethora of African Americans used the mediums as a way to express what it was like to be a part of a minority group in America. Some prominent figures who emerged during this time were Duke Ellington, who influenced jazz as one of its creators, and Langston Hughes, who created poems to unify the community. Artists like these helped create new opportunities for future artists of color.
When African Americans moved to New York, they needed to find jobs and occupations so they could support their families. Some of them started careers in music and entertainment, like Duke Ellington and Josephine Baker. Ellington was a pianist who grew most of his fame from performing in the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club was a club that featured black musicians and entertainers located on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem, New York. Music was a way for him to keep him entertained. He started playing piano at the age of 7. Some of his well-known songs were It Don't Mean a Thing, Take the A-Train, and Mood Indigo. The Cotton Club didn't just also host musicians, it also hosted entertainers like Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker was a very popular performer for the Cotton Club. Even though she was from France, she represented the African American community just as much as anybody else did. She was also part of the NAACP, which was an American civil rights organization for black people, but we'll get into that later. Harlem even had their own original homegrown style called the Harlem Stride, where musicians added piano to the brass instruments of jazz. A very important theater production during the Renaissance was the one titled 3 Plays for a Negro Theater. It was a production by black creators showcasing black characters conveying complex emotions, and it went mainstream at the time. This was massive for the community's public image at the time. Not only were there musicians and entertainers of the Harlem Renaissance, there were artists like Aaron Douglas, Augustus Savage, and James Van Der Zee. These artists produced paintings that helped black people reclaim their identity and tackle the common stereotypes that were often consensus about them. These stereotypes stem from centuries of deep degradation, misinterpretation, and false characters for the sake of control. Aaron Douglas witnessed Harlem's increase in fine arts during his brief visit to New York in 1925 while getting ready to head to Paris. This persuaded him to stay for a bit. Through further persuasion from his German mentor, Douglas decided that he would draw inspiration from both African and American aesthetics and use them intrinsically in his artwork to develop a new visual identity. Drawing upon the African side of his inspiration, Douglas used geometric and layered forms to render styles scenes. Augusta Savage overcame her strict childhood under religiously tight parents that condemned her for being interested in sculpting. Participating in the Great Migration in 1921, she made her way from Jacksonville, Florida to New York City, earned a scholarship to attend art school, and studied African art and culture. She went on to sculpt many depictions of notable people in the community, which is how she eventually became enmeshed in the vast creative community in Harlem. She created most of her groundbreaking works, which won many prestigious awards and was featured on the front of several magazines at the time. James Van Der Zee was a man who captured the life of Harlem for years at his very own photography studio, Guarantee Photo Studio. This was the go-to place for Harlem residents when it came to special occasions, weddings, funerals, birthdays, you name it. He was a well-regarded artist too, as he fashioned his photos in a way to tell the stories he wanted to. Prior to the Renaissance, black sculptors and painters didn't often voice their opinions on African American subject matters. But during the Renaissance, many started to use their own artistic influence to confront racism. They used their art to express love for their identities and share experiences. People like Aaron Douglas, Augusta Savage, and James Van Der Zee made artists confident in their beliefs that intellect, art, literature, theater, and music could challenge racism and transform the American society into the one that protects the occupations of black people.
Countee Cullen was one of the highest regarded poets to come from the Harlem Renaissance. He was firmly against the notion that his racial background should be a factor in how his literature is seen, believing art transcended race and should be used as a vehicle to bring people of differing backgrounds closer together. This philosophy was similar to the views of other big names in the Renaissance, such as Langston Hughes, who was all for people of color creating their own distinct art based on their race. On that note, Langston Hughes is not only one of the most prominent and influential poets during his time, but one of the most influential people to come from the Renaissance as a whole. Hughes was one of the first black writers that actually earned a stable income off of his works, making hundreds of poems. He didn't just stop at poems though. He wrote collections of short stories, novels, stage plays, autobiographies, and children's books to encourage young people of color to follow their dreams. However, he still acknowledged how the American dream can be hard to achieve for African Americans, particularly in his poem Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? That is an excerpt from the poem. This poem would go on to become one of his most popular, even being referenced by Martin Luther King Jr. in several of his speeches. Langston Hughes has received several awards for his works, even an award after his death with the Quill Award for Poetry in 2005, one of the highest allocates an writer can receive. Another well-regarded poet of the Renaissance was Claude McKay, a Jamaican-American radical socialist immigrant who is best known for creating the poems If We Must Die and America, and his novel Home to Harlem blended of race-conscious and revolutionary with a romantic sensibility. The Harlem Renaissance had a huge impact on the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. It was able to set up Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and many others to continue to fight for racial inequality in the later decades. Langston Hughes, Duke Ellington, Josephine Baker, Webb Du Bois, and the whole NAACP set a great start in this journey. The NAACP was a human rights group that helped colored people advance in their lives through racial segregation. It stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was founded by Webb Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and many others. These people wanted their racial community and others to work around color barriers and fight racial inequality and segregation. It was very important for them to fight for us on the intellect side, while people did the marching and protesting. These nonviolent movements like music and marches ended in success. The community was finally freed from segregation, and racial inequality became lesser and lesser as the years went by. In conclusion, the Harlem Renaissance was just the first step and a very influential step in stopping racial inequality, helping people of color find occupations through several creative and intellectual jobs. Thank you for listening and watching our documentary.